Matti Friedman is a journalist and prize-winning author. He was born in Toronto and lives in Jerusalem with his family. Friedman's second topic this morning, Jews from Arab countries, is related to one of his latest books, Spies of No Country, Secret Lives at the Birth of Israel. The history of Jews in Arab countries is a secret to most people in Norway, but Friedman is about to reveal secrets that are not even known to those of us familiar with the topic. The floor is yours.
Hello again. I hope you're not tired of hearing from me. We're going to talk about what I think is perhaps the most important thing to know about Israel in 2023. We're talking about this gap in perception between the story that people tell about Israel outside of Israel and the reality of Israel from the inside. And I think that this is the most important thing to know because it is the most foreign to people looking at Israel from the West. And that is, as we mentioned at the end of the previous talk, the fact that Israel's Jewish population is largely of Middle Eastern and North African descent. And the way I'm going to talk about this, as briefly as possible, of course, is to tell you a story about spies. I wrote a book called Spies of No Country, which is about Israel's first spies. It's about the birth of the Mossad, more or less. Of course, we all know the heroic stories of the Mossad, and we have this idea of this highly sophisticated organization. The Mossad has very modest beginnings in the years right around 1948, and it has a lot to do with this ethnic double identity that I'm going to talk about. Of course, spies have cover stories and they have double identities and they conceal themselves with other stories about themselves. And I think to some extent, the same is true of Israel. We have an official story about ourselves, which is a very European story. And to this day, the official story of Israel is that European story that we went through before, which is Herzl, kibbutz, Holocaust, Ben Gurion. And of course, if you look at the early Zionist propaganda posters, the pioneers would always be blonde. You know, the pioneer would be hoeing the fields in the day and listening to Beethoven in the kibbutz dining hall in the evening. And this was very much the picture of Israel that we wanted to project. Have any of you seen the movie Exodus? Do you remember the movie Exodus, 1961? The movie that really sets the idea of Israel, not just in America, but in the West, based on this best-selling book that came out in the late 50s by Leon Uris. Who plays the Israeli in Exodus? Who is the ultimate Israeli as presented by this movie? Paul Newman, right? He's Ari Ben Canaan, who is the ultimate Israeli, and Paul Newman is this beautiful, blonde, blue-eyed god, and he's supposed to represent Israel's founding generation. And when actually, if you've ever seen pictures of Israel's founding generation, they look like Groucho Marx. They don't look like Paul Newman. But you just wouldn't want to watch a whole movie about them. So we make this character, which is largely an imaginary character of an Israeli who looks like Paul Newman, which is very much part of the European narrative or the European picture that Israel wants to project, particularly in its early years. I was writing a book, which was my first book, called the Aleppo Codex. And it's a dirty story about an ancient copy of the Bible. And one of the main characters in that story is an old Mossad agent named Rafi Siton, who came from Aleppo in Syria, moved to Israel as a young person and became a spy. And as we were talking, he said, Matti, you should really meet a friend of mine who is an even older retired spy named Yitzhak Shoshan. And he lives in Bat Yam, which is about an hour from Jerusalem. And I wasn't sure why I was going to see Yitzhak Shoshan, but I've learned in many years as a journalist that if anyone ever offers to introduce you to an old spy, go. You'll never regret it. So I got in the car and I went from Jerusalem to Bat Yam, and I arrive at this very kind of Soviet-style workers' block of apartment buildings, and I got into this elevator. And if you've ever been in these old Israeli buildings, you know it's an elevator that's like the size of a phone booth. And I went up to the 7th floor, and waiting for me with the door open is a guy who was, at the time, in his early 90s. He was about this tall, a giant of Israeli intelligence. But he came up to my shoulder, and he had a mustache, and he had glasses, and that was Yitzhak Shoshan. And I sat down with him in his kitchen, and I heard a story from him about the founding of the state that sounded like no other story that I'd ever heard about Israeli independence. And I thought that I knew how Israel was founded. I was pretty sure that I knew all of the stories, or at least most of them. And Yitzhak told me a story that was completely new to me. And I'm going to tell you the very short version, and then I'm going to explain to you why I think it's important. After that first meeting, I went back again and again. At first, he didn't understand what I wanted from him and why I was constantly calling and telling him that I was coming. But in the end, he got used to me, and we just sat in his kitchen for hours and hours, and he would get up very slowly, and he'd walk over to the stove, and he would make me black coffee in this like a tin pot with a long handle, which is called a finjan, which was the way they used to make coffee in the old days of the Palmach, which is this kind of mythic militia that helps found Israel. And he would make me black coffee, and we'd sit down, and he would just tell me the story. He would tell me his story. What is his story? Yitzhak is born in Aleppo, Syria, with a different name. His name is Zaki Shasho. And Zaki Shasho is basically an alley kid. His dad is a janitor in a school. He has no shoes. He grows up running around the alleys of Aleppo. At the time, Aleppo has a Jewish community that's about 10,000 people. This is the 1920s, 1930s. At the time, there are about 1 million Jews who are native to the Islamic world, mostly the Arab world, and also non-Arab Islamic countries like Turkey and Iran. We're talking about a population that in the 1940s is about 1 million people. Baghdad, the Iraqi capital, in the 1940s is 1/3 Jewish, which is hard to imagine now. But this is an old and large, very deeply rooted Jewish world inside Islam. Zaki, as he was then known, runs away from Aleppo during the Second World War because he realizes that he has no future personally in Aleppo and that there is no future for Jews in Syria. He can feel the hostility rising as the 1940s progress, in part because the Zionist presence in Israel is growing, and in part because Nazi propaganda has real purchase in the Arab world. Hostility to Jews rises, and he realizes that he has to get out. And he runs away to join the pioneers. He runs away to join the Zionists. And for a kid from Syria, running away to the land of Israel is walking across the border. Right? For Europeans, getting to the land of Israel, it involved finding a boat and, hiking across the Carpathian mountains. And but if you're from Syria, it's kind of down the road from Aleppo to Haifa. Excuse me. He crosses the border, sneaks across the border illegally, spends some time selling red peppers in a market in Tel Aviv, the Levinsky Street Market. And then he's picked up, he's basically a street kid, he's a teenager in Tel Aviv in the 1940s. He's picked up by someone from a kibbutz, someone who's collecting these kids who are washing up in Tel Aviv without their parents, and a kind of a socialist, idealist counselor from one of the kibbutzim who takes this kid, Zaki, to a kibbutz. And on this kibbutz, Zaki tries to transform himself into a sabra. Now, in Israel, which wasn't called Israel yet, at that time, more than 90% of the Jews are from Europe, Eastern Europe mostly, what we would call Ashkenazim, which is a very broad umbrella term for anyone who comes from the Christian world. The term in use today for anyone who comes from the Islamic world is Mizrahim, which means Easterners. These are very clumsy generalizations, but the population in pre-state Israel is almost entirely of European descent, and there are very few Jews from the Islamic world who are part of the Zionist movement at that time. And the kids on this kibbutz don't know what to make of Zaki, because he's Jewish, but he speaks Arabic. And he seems very Arab. He seems like the enemy to them. He doesn't seem like a Jew. He doesn't know Yiddish. He doesn't come from their world. And he tries to fit in. He does everything that he can to fit in on the kibbutz. He changes his name. So from Zaki Shasho, he starts calling himself Yitzchak, which is a biblical name, Isaac, right? The name of the patriarch Isaac, Shoshan. He changes his name from Shasho to Shoshan, which means rose in Hebrew. And he becomes, he goes from being, a street kid from an Arab city to being a chalutz, to being a pioneer named Yitzchak Shoshan, but it doesn't work. He still can't be accepted on the kibbutz. He eats the food that everyone eats on the kibbutz, even though he thinks it's disgusting because he has much better food from Aleppo, but he wants to fit in. And at the same time as he is trying and failing to fit in on this kibbutz around 1945, other kids with the same profile are washing up on different kibbutzim in British Mandate Palestine. And they're having the same experience. They want to be pioneers, they want to join the Zionist movement, but they're too Arab to be accepted by the Sabras. Another one is called, we'll see photos of some of them in a moment, is named Jamil Cohen. Jamil Cohen ends up on another kibbutz, starts calling himself Gamliel instead of Jamil. It's hard to imagine a world where Jamil Cohen was a normal name. But that was the case in the 1940s. And he too cannot find acceptance on the kibbutz. And there are lots of these kids on different kibbutzim who are trying to be pioneers, but are finding that they are too Arab to be accepted by the Jews. At that very moment, a recruiter shows up on the kibbutzim, an Iraqi Jew whose name, he goes by an Arabic name. They call him Sam'an. In Hebrew, his name is Shimon Somech. And he's a Jew from Baghdad who is part of the pre-state Zionist defense organizations. And he is looking for kids who can't fit in on the kibbutzim because they seem too Arab. So the disability, the obstacle for these kids, the fact that they seem too Arab to fit in with the pioneers, that's exactly what Sam'an is looking for because he wants spies. And he understands that what the spies are going to need is Jews who can cross the street into an Arab neighborhood and later into the Arab world and disappear. Who can do that? Jamil Cohen can do it, and Zaki Shasho can do it. So they are told that they have to abandon their attempt to fit in with the kibbutznikim and go back to their Arab identity. So stop trying to be Yitzchak Shoshan. Instead, go back to being Zaki Shasho. And not just that, we're not going to just revert to your Arab Jewish identity from Aleppo. We're actually going to give you a Muslim identity. And Zaki Shasho, otherwise known as Yitzchak Shoshan, who is the man that I met in Bat Yam when he was in his early 90s, he's given a third identity. Now his name is Abdul Karim Muhammad Sidki. And he has a different life story. He's a Palestinian Muslim from Jaffa. And Jamil Cohen is given a new name. He has been trying to call himself Gamliel Cohen, but now he's told to identify himself as Yusuf El-Hamed, another Palestinian Muslim. And the same thing is done with a group of about a dozen very young people who become the nucleus of the Mossad. And this happens in the years between the end of the Second World War and Israeli independence. And I'm giving you a very short version of what is a very complicated story, but they initially just cross the street into an Arab neighborhood in Haifa or in Jerusalem and try to fit in. And they discovered that it's not that easy because in Arabic, dialect is very important and you can be identified by your accent and by your choice of word. So, in one part of Haifa, there's one word for train, for example, and if you come from somewhere else in the Galilee, you use a different word. So if you use the wrong word, they know you're lying. Or if you say that you're a worker, but you're dressed like a clerk, they know you're lying. Or if you say that you're a Muslim, but your accent is Christian, they know you're lying. So they realize that this is a very dangerous pursuit, and it takes them a few years to get good at it. Whether they were ever actually good is one question, but they become passable at espionage. And as soon as the War of Independence breaks out, they begin using these guys as the only effective intelligence service that the Jews have in the 1948 war. They're the only people who can cross the border. Because, of course, a Jew from Europe can't pretend to be an Arab. but these guys can. And they begin by collecting intelligence on different villages. Who is the strong family in this village? Who's the muhtar? Who's the guy in charge of the village? How many guns are in the village? How big is the armed militia of this village or of this neighborhood? And they start putting together a picture of life on the Arab side, which is, by the way, not just military. And we have these incredible files written by these men, which are almost anthropological descriptions. What movies people were watching, what pop songs people were listening to in Arab Haifa in 1948, what people were eating for lunch. There's a lot on food, and it's an incredible portrait of a society, not just of military threats. The spies spend months working at the Haifa port as simple port workers, and again under their assumed identities, and then they graduate to an assassination. They carry out an attempted assassination of an important military and religious leader in Haifa in February 1948, a guy named Nimer el-Khatib, who is an important leader in Arab Haifa. And this small group of spies who call themselves the Arab section, they're instructed to get rid of Nimer el-Khatib. They don't succeed in killing him, but they succeed in putting him out of action. At one point in early 1948, the Haganah, which is the pre-state defense service, realizes that an Arab militia in Haifa is preparing a truck bomb to go off in the Jewish part of Haifa, and it's disguised as an ambulance. And at the time, of course, there's no Jewish army, there's no Jewish Air Force, there's no way to destroy this truck bomb except by using their own truck bomb. So they send the agents of the Arab section, including Yitzhak Shoshan, who I met, they send them into Arab Haifa with an Oldsmobile that has been booby-trapped. And through a very long and interesting story, the plan, of course, doesn't work as expected. Nothing does. They manage to blow up this truck bomb with their own truck bomb. The men are trained to be indistinguishable from Palestinian Arabs. And here, I think, is the most important point. They're taken to a training camp and they're instructed in Islam, because these men are Jews, so they don't know much about Islam. But they don't have to be trained in Arabic because Arabic is their native language. So in their memory of this time, some of them write memoirs afterward. They remember themselves as Israeli spies, but they weren't Israelis. The term Israeli wasn't in use at the time. They were something much more fuzzy and much more interesting, I think. They also don't want to call themselves spies, because the word spies in Arabic has a negative connotation. It means like there's something traitorous. If you're a spy, you're someone who's betraying your own people. So no one wants to be a spy. They need to come up with a different name for themselves, and the name will be familiar to anyone who has seen Fauda. If there's any Fauda fans, the agents in Fauda use a term for themselves, which is a fascinating Hebrew term, which exists in no other language as far as I know except for Arabic. The term is mista'arvim. The Hebrew term mista'arvim, which is almost impossible to translate into English. The literal meaning of mista'arvim is those who become like Arabs. So there's a word in Hebrew for the act of becoming like Arabs. Mista'arvim. Where does this word come from? They didn't make it up. The guys from the Arab section didn't make it up. They took it from the lives of the Jews who had always lived among Arabs. In Aleppo, for example, which is the community that Yitzhak Shoshan came from, there were always two groups of Jews. There were the Jews who called themselves Sfaradim, Jews who had come from Spain after the expulsion from Spain in 1492. And there was a much older group of Jews who had always been in Aleppo and who had been Arabized after the Arab conquest in the 7th century. They'd been in Aleppo for about 1,000 years before Islam. But when the Arab conquerors came, they became Arabized. They became like Arabs. They learned to speak Arabic, and they adopted Arab culture, and they called themselves Mista'arvim, or in Arabic, Musta'arabin, those who become like Arabs. So when the spies have to call themselves something, they reach back into the history of the Jews of Islam, and they pull out this very useful word, which is a word that describes not necessarily an intelligence function, but a social action, of becoming like Arabs, mista'arvim. And that word is still in use in Israel today to describe agents who can cross the lines. And if you've seen Fauda, those agents are mista'arvim, but the word comes into modern Hebrew through the guys in the Arab section. And maybe we can see a few slides just so you can picture what this looks like and who the men were. Yitzhak Shoshan, who I met when he was in his early 90s, he passed away 2.5 years ago when he was 96. And I was in touch with him to the end, and I even managed to bring him a copy of the book, which has his picture on the cover. And he couldn't read it. He didn't speak English, and he was very elderly at the time, but he was very touched, and I consider that to be one of the peak moments in my journalistic career. That's Yitzhak. Thank you. It's true. Yitzhak is the one closest to us, the one with a kind of a wicked grin on his face. This is taken in Beirut. The other agent is Ibrahim. That was his cover name. His real name was Chavakuk Cohen, and he was a Jew from Yemen. When Arab Haifa falls to the Haganah in 1948, there's a wave of refugees that flees Haifa for Lebanon. And the Jewish military commanders understand that this is an opportunity, and they send the Arab section guys, a few of them, to blend in with the refugees and flee to Lebanon. And that is how Israel sets up its first foreign intelligence station. These are, just to understand the ironies, these are Jewish refugees from Arab countries who are pretending to be Arab refugees from a Jewish country. And that's how they end up in Beirut. And they set up an intelligence station, it makes it sound like more than it was. It was just a rooftop. They didn't have a radio at first. Israeli intelligence in 1948 did not own a radio. It did not own a camera. They're sent to Lebanon with no way of communicating. So when the state is declared in the middle of May 1948, these agents don't know. They don't know the country exists. All they know is what they're reading in Arab newspapers, which is that the Arab armies are victorious and that the Jewish enclave has been erased. So they think for a few weeks that they've been sent to spy for a country that doesn't exist. A few months later, they get a radio, and they set it up on this rooftop. They disguise the antenna as a clothesline. They hang their underwear on it, and they start tapping out messages to Israeli intelligence headquarters, which is a table in a shed in a kibbutz called Givat HaShlosha. That's headquarters, and I've seen the messages because someone was writing them down with a pencil, and I found them in the archives. Let's see some more photos. This is Yitzhak and Chavakuk. This is another one of the 4 agents who are the main characters of my book. This is Yakuba Cohen, he's also a legend of Israeli intelligence, and he's active in Israeli intelligence until his 70s. He's still active, and here he is dressed up as a soldier in the Arab Legion. And he's actually a Jew of Persian descent. He grows up in Jerusalem. He's born in Jerusalem and grows up speaking Arabic with Jews from Arab countries and with Palestinian Muslims. So he has good Arabic, and he's one of the key agents in this Beirut operation. Jamil Cohen, who we mentioned earlier, thinks that his function is to gather intelligence, and Yakuba thinks that his function is to blow things up. And there's a lot of tension between the two of them. Let's see another one. That's Jamil, Gamliel. You can kind of get a sense of him. He's the most intellectual of the 4 agents who I concentrate on. The Arab section is about a dozen agents. About half of them are caught and killed. I concentrate on 4 of them. Gamliel was considered the most intellectual because he finished high school. These are 2 Arab section men who were caught in 1948. The agents who I wrote the book about headed north for Lebanon. These 2 headed south and crossed the lines into Egyptian-held territory, where they were caught and photographed and executed. And their bodies have never been found. They're buried somewhere in Gaza, but we don't know exactly where. This is Nissim Atiyeh, another man from the Arab section. He was 19 years old. He was disguised as a peddler, and he was sent out. They dropped him off near the city of Lod in 1948, and he vanished. And he's never been seen since. No idea what happened to him. He was clearly caught and killed, but we don't know where his body is. These were two mista'arvim, two other guys from the Arab section, Gidon and David. They were sent into Jaffa. They were both Iraqi Jews, and they were 21 years old, and they were sent into Jaffa disguised as workers to try to figure out what the Palestinian militia in Jaffa was doing. And they were also caught, and the radio or the telephone traffic between the people who caught them has been preserved. They suspected them of being Jewish agents but couldn't prove it. So the militiamen told them to wash their hands as a Muslim would wash his hands before prayer. Hands and face. There's a ritual washing called wudu, which you have to perform before prayer in a mosque. Any Muslim would know how to do it. They made them do it, and they couldn't. And that was how they were caught. And both of them were executed. Their bodies were never found until 4 decades later. They were building a school. Israel had come into being, and they were building a school in a suburb of Tel Aviv called Cholon. And they found 2 bodies, and understood that these were casualties from the War of Independence, but they didn't know who they were. And it was only 2 decades after that that they figured out that it was these 2 mista'arvim who'd been caught and killed in Jaffa at the very end of 1947. This is Najib Ibrahim Hamouda, according to his fake British identity, but his real name was Yaakov Bukai, and he was another Syrian Jew who was caught at Mandelbaum Gate, which was the crossing point between Jewish Jerusalem and Arab Jerusalem in 1948, and he was hanged in Amman. These are pictures that are of no intelligence importance, okay? This is not like from the secret files of the Mossad or something, but these were very young people, and they were in Beirut, and it was really their first time they'd ever been away from home, and they had some money, and they had a good time. That's Yitzhak, again, Yitzhak Shoshan, who I met in Bat Yam, skiing on Mount Lebanon, and seeming to be enjoying himself. This might be my favorite picture. Again, hard to really make an argument for the importance to the history of the Mossad, but they spent a lot of time at the beach. They got themselves into trouble with local women. They were away from home for about 2 years in Beirut, living under fake identities. And of course, they'd never been trained. There was no spy school. They were just improvising. And they were making it up as they went along. And one thing that happens if you send very young men off for a couple of years is that they will exercise bad judgment. And indeed, that happened in the case of Yitzhak Shoshan with a Christian woman from Beirut named Georgette. And it almost sinks the entire operation. A mistake involving a Christian woman who had a violent brother. But that's a story that I tell in the book. That was the last picture. So why does all of this matter? And there are many more stories about the spies. There's a story about Hitler's yacht. I don't know if you've ever heard the story about Hitler's yacht showing up in Beirut in the fall of 1948 and what Israeli intelligence did about it. It's a very strange story that is really the first foreign operation of Israeli intelligence. Hitler, it's too long. I'd love to tell you, but you're not interested in Hitler's yacht. Yeah, the Israeli intelligence decides that they must sink Hitler's yacht, even though it's 3 years after the war, and Hitler is not on the yacht. But the yacht shows up in Beirut, and they decide that it is of national importance to sink it. And the guy in the bathing suit is sent to do it. And again, the plan doesn't quite work, but it doesn't quite not work either. Why does all this matter, beyond the nice story about spies? Israel in 2023 cannot be understood as a European country. And I often meet people who come from Jewish communities in North America who arrive in Israel and are very confused by this. For example, if a Jew from North America comes to Israel, right, they grew up in a Jewish community, they see Israel as an extension of the Jewish world that they know, and might want to go get some Jewish food, right? We're in Israel, it's a Jewish state, let's go get some Jewish food. There is no Jewish food in Israel, right? There's no deli in Israel. Bagels, which for us in North America, that we associate that with the most Jewish kind of food. Bagels arrive in Israel maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and Israelis think that it's American food. They don't understand that it's Jewish food, which I discovered when I took my kids to Toronto, which is where I'm from, last summer. I decided that we must take the kids to the homeland. I have two 16-year-olds, one 12-year-old and a 6-year-old. We took them to Toronto. I took them to the most Jewish part of Toronto, which is where I grew up. And we took them to a Jewish restaurant called United Bakers, and I got them bagels and lox, and they liked it. But I realized in the middle of lunch that they thought it was authentic Canadian cuisine. They had no sense of it as being Jewish because for them, Jewish food is the food of the Levant and North Africa. Couscous, hummus, the kind of food that Israelis eat, which you would see at any Israeli supermarket. If you turn on a pop station in Israel, what you're going to hear is a kind of music that we call Mizrahi. Mizrahi means Eastern, and it's Middle Eastern pop music in Hebrew, which is the local form of pop music. It is the dominant form of pop music in Israel. That is what most people listen to. That's what the kids listen to. The biggest artists in Israel are Mizrahi artists. And none of this makes any sense if you think of Israel as a country of European Jews who are dropped into the Middle East. Judaism in Israel is very Middle Eastern. And it's often foreign to people who come from Protestant countries. So in Israel, we don't really have Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism and Orthodox Judaism, which is the way it's set up in North America and in other Protestant countries. What we have is basically Middle Eastern Judaism. What is Middle Eastern Judaism? There is one synagogue. You may not go there all the time, but you would never start your own synagogue. You recognize that this is the synagogue. You might say kiddush, the blessing over wine on a Friday night, as you are required to do according to Jewish law, and then go to a soccer game, which you're not allowed to do according to Jewish law. In the Mizrahi music world, the stars will often project a religious persona as part of their stage persona, which means religious music sometimes on stage. And they'll often, if you follow them on Facebook, you'll see that they observe religious holidays, and they're very kind of overt about their religious observance, but many of them will have tattoos, which is also forbidden according to Jewish law. So there's a kind of flexibility in religious observance, which is familiar to people who are, for example, Middle Eastern Christians. If you know any Middle Eastern Christians, you know, Maronites or Arameans or people from the Middle Eastern Christian sects, it's often quite similar. And in many ways, Israel is much easier to understand today for a Muslim from Beirut than for a Jew from London or New York. Because the society is Middle Eastern, and that is in large part because more than half of the Jews in Israel have roots in the Levant and North Africa. And I'm being a bit vague about the numbers because there has been a lot of intermarriage. So if your dad is Romanian and your mom is Yemeni, we don't know what you are. So it's hard to classify. It's not black and white, so it's at least 50%. Most importantly, and I'll end with this, our politics. Our politics cannot be understood if you understand Israel as a European society. Israel needs to be understood as a society that is made up at least in 50% by the descendants of the people who we just saw on the screen, by the children and grandchildren of people who could cross the street and pass as Arabs. It's not a footnote. This is a huge part of what Israel is, and even the Jews who came from Europe to Israel have been Middle Easternized over 3-4 generations in Israel, and have become part of the story of the Jews of Islam. In an interesting way, we tell the story of Israel as if the Jews from the Islamic world joined the story of the Jews of Europe. That's how we tell the story. But in my opinion, what happened was the opposite. What happened was that the remnant of the Jews of Europe joins the story of the Jews of Islam, which is a different way of thinking about Israel, but Israel today is shaped by our contact with Islam. It has very little to do with politics in Norway or the UK or Canada. It has a lot to do with Islam, and it's much easier to understand Israel from Aleppo than it is from Oslo or Toronto or New York. Politics. Many of the debates that we claim are about policy are actually about identity. And we don't like to talk about this, but it's true. And it's also not reflected in the news coverage that you'll consume. The voting base of the Israeli center-left has traditionally been Jews of European background, mainly East European background, what we would call Ashkenazim as a broad cultural term. The voting base of the Israeli right, primarily the Likud, which is the biggest party on the right, has traditionally been Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. So debates about settlements or about legal reform would seem to be ideological debates about policy, but in fact they sit on a base of identity, and it has a lot less to do with points of disagreement on modern day politics than it does with the fault line that was created in Israel at the founding of the state. Israel is founded by Jews from Eastern Europe to save the Jews of Europe. That was the idea of Israel. Israel was supposed to save the Jews of Europe. The Zionist movement understood correctly that a catastrophe was coming and that people needed to be given a way out of Europe. And Israel, by the way, fails. We like to think of Israel as a success story, and it is in many ways. But Israel fails to save the people that it's supposed to save because it is founded too late. It's not the fault of the Zionist movement. But by the time Israel is founded, the people who are supposed to come to Israel are dead, with few exceptions. So we get remnants from Europe, and we get, unexpectedly, a wave of immigration from the Islamic world, where about 1 million Jews are native. Almost all of those Jews are forced out, and most come to Israel. And they come in speaking Arabic. And they come in with stories like Zaki Shasho and Jamil Cohen. They come in with a very different Jewish story. And the founders of the state don't know what to make of them, and they treat them with disdain. And these people are told that they have to be secular, but they don't want to be secular. They're attached to their religious tradition. They're told that they should be socialists, but they don't want to be socialists. They have a different way of thinking about themselves. They're told to stop speaking Arabic, that Arabic is primitive, but they don't really think that because, of course, Jewish life has been conducted in Arabic for centuries. And some of the great Jewish texts, like the work of Maimonides, for example, were written in Arabic. So a fault line is created in those years where this very large part of the Israeli populace is treated with disdain by the founders, who are from the left, from the kibbutz movement, from the socialist left, and they're treated with more respect by the right, by the party that eventually becomes Likud, by Menachem Begin. The right in Israel has a better sense of who these people are and how they want to be treated, and the political line is set in the early years of the state, and it persists to this day. So if you look at the current fighting about legal reform, look at who's on the street protesting against the government and who is not on the street, you will see an ethnic divide. And if you talk to Israelis about what they think about modern day politics, and then you ask them about their family background, you will often find that it conforms. That you can often predict people's political leanings based on their family identity, which seems very tribal. And we don't like to think of ourselves that way, but it is true. To sum up, an attempt to understand Israel today as being a story about Europe will lead to confusion and misunderstanding. Israel in 2023 is a story about the Middle East. And it's about Jews in the Middle East, and it's about Jews who are from the Middle East. Because for more than half of the Jews in Israel, the meeting with Islam doesn't happen in 1948. They've always lived among Muslims. The story of their families over centuries and centuries is a story of being a minority among Muslims. And then they're forced out of their homes in Morocco or Iraq or Yemen or Syria, and they move to a different part of the Islamic world, but they're still in the Islamic world being formed as a minority among Muslims. And the Jews who come from Europe, from the Christian world, now find themselves as a minority among Muslims. So the story is the story of the Jews of Islam. And that requires us in the West, to make a leap from the Western context with which we have always tried to understand Israel and leap into the Islamic world and understand the country in a very different way. This too will not be in that simplified news narrative, which uses Israelis largely as a stand-in for the powerful Western world, but it is very much the reality of the country. And if you see things this way, you can stand on a street in Israel and make sense of the people who are walking by you, and of course, you won't be able to tell in many cases if they're Jews or Arabs, and there's a very complicated story there, one that is crucial to understanding not just the past of Israel, but the present as well. Okay, I'd be happy to take as many questions, again, as we have time for, as funneled through the censor and through...
Thank you. We have another 15 minutes to take questions and answers. And I realize you have the same problem as I have. I usually, when it comes to time, I usually excuse myself. I'm a Jew, I'm a lawyer, what did you expect? Anyway.
That's half true of me. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, you spoke about Jewish food, and it was the food of Levant, bagels with lox. That's from America. My Jewish food as a child, that was gefilte fish, gehackte Leber, and Lokschenkugel. Just so that you know. The term is very disturbing.
Also very hard to find in Israel, by the way. Rightly so.
Yeah. Anyway, going to the questions. Have you experienced international media telling the story of Jewish refugees from the Middle East and North Africa?
So that's a great question. Does this story of what we would broadly call the Mizrachim exist in the mainstream news narrative? The basic answer is no. It's just not part of the story, which again is I think aimed to be a parable about the West and not to explain the actual country of Israel. Occasionally you will see it mentioned. Sometimes there are attempts to portray the Jews of the Islamic world as victims of Zionism. That is, everyone was living happily, they were accepted, and things were peaceful, and then the Zionists came along and tried to set up a state in Palestine, and that triggered hostility against the Jews who were native to Islamic countries. So that's a narrative that you will see sometimes, and you should ask, if you know Jews who came from Islamic countries, you can ask them for their own experience of it and hear whether they think that's accurate or not. But largely it's absent because it complicates the picture. If we're aiming for that very simple princess dragon dynamic where the Israeli is the empowered white European, then the fact that at least half of the Jews in Israel are as native to the Islamic world as Palestinian Muslims or as anyone else in the region, that scrambles the story. In fact, it almost completely undermines the story. So any information that undermines the powerful moral story that's been constructed must be left out. And in some of my writing, I've given other examples of stories like that. Peace offers that we were not allowed to cover, for example. Even on the micro level, you'll often see footage from an Israeli airstrike in Gaza, but you will never see, or very rarely see, footage of a rocket launch from Gaza. Certain facts suit the story and certain facts don't. And a big fact that doesn't suit the story is the story of the Jews of the Arab world. And in an interesting way, there's been a kind of a meeting of interests here between our own desire to be European and the desire on the part of the Arab world to portray us as European. Because again, the Zionist movement wanted to be blonde. That was part of the self-image in the early years. And that plays into the propaganda of the other side because they also want to portray Israelis as foreign interlopers, kind of crusaders who come from outer space and land, in the Middle East. And you can really see this in a fascinating way if you go to Cairo. I don't know if you've ever been to Cairo. In Cairo, there is an incredible monument to the most important day in the history of the Egyptian army, which is the first day of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And there's an incredible mural in Cairo, which is a very kind of socialist realism painted by North Korean artists. And it shows the Egyptian soldiers heroically storming across the Suez Canal. And it shows the Israelis surrendering. So the Israelis are begging for their life like this, or they have their hands up like this. It's an incredibly powerful mural, and all of the Israelis are blonde. And which is amazing, because if you've ever seen an Israeli military unit, you've probably noticed that not all of the Israelis are blonde. In fact, many of the Israelis look like Egyptians. In fact, at least some of the Israeli soldiers on the Suez Canal in 1973 were Egyptians. Right? There are 80,000 Jews native to Egypt. They're all kicked out. Most of them become Israelis, and some of them are Israeli soldiers. But that is so complicated that it has to be ignored. And the way you ignore it is by pretending that all the Israelis are blonde, because that assigns guilt to Europe, and it suggests that the Arab world is paying the price for a European crime, the Holocaust. And it also erases your own guilt, because if the Israelis are blonde, then no one has to ask what happened to the 80,000 Jews of Egypt, and what happened to 250,000 Jews in Morocco, and what happened to 1 million Jews who are native to the Islamic world. It's better to make that question disappear. And you do it by making the Israelis blonde.
Thank you. We still have room for more questions. Here's one. Why are Jews moving from Western countries to Israel, where they face difficulties on so many levels?
That's a great question. And I get asked that often by Israelis. You know, if you come from Russia or Morocco, Israelis will not ask you, why did you come? But if you come from a country like Canada or like Norway, Israelis will often be puzzled. Like, what was so bad in Canada that made you come to Israel? So, I mean, I think there's two parts of, or there are multiple answers. One is that the pull to Israel is not just a push from countries that are inhospitable. For us, it's the draw of the homeland and of being part of a majority. And even in a friendly country like Canada, being part of a minority it's uncomfortable sometimes. And I grew up in public schools, but I wore a kippah. And I never had any problems. I never experienced anything that I would call anti-Semitism. My friends were not Jewish and they were lovely. But you're out of step. Your holidays are not everyone's holidays. You're part of a culture that is out of step with the culture of the majority. You're not always sure how you're being perceived by other people. And that's uncomfortable. And that, I think, was one thing that was going on. In other countries, I think there's a buzz of hostility that Jews pick up. And I'm not familiar enough with the life of this country to say either way, but I certainly meet Jews coming from prosperous, liberal countries in the West who say, yes, the country was economically great and we had good jobs and life was good, but there was just something. There was some discomfort with being openly Jewish, some discomfort around Israel, some deep discomfort that made it worth it or made it logical for me to move to the Middle East and deal with the whole set of difficulties that Israel presents, rather than the set of difficulties that they faced in a place like Toronto or Oslo. And it's hard to understand. I mean, Israel presents a huge list of difficulties: the army, the security situation, the kind of crazy nature of our domestic politics, rockets that come in from Gaza with some frequency. Is it really worth it to choose that and not this? But for some people it is. And I think it says something about the discomfort of Jewish life. We've had a wave of immigration from France. What's wrong in France? It's Western Europe. Everything seems great in France, but my neighborhood is full of French Jews who've come in the past 2 or 3 years. Why? And when you talk to them, you see that everything is great, but, and that but drives Jews to Israel.
We had a program, Strictly Dancing or something like that, ballroom dancing. And one of the participants, she presented herself very shortly, just for a second or two, as coming from Morocco, being a Berber, and being persecuted in Morocco. Okay? And you would have thought a program like that, a personal story like that, would have hit the news. It didn't. She said it, and it was 2 seconds, and it was off, and nobody ever took it up again. I have a feeling that this is not only a Jewish Arab problem. It's in many ways the problem of taking up in the Western countries problems that you might experience with the Muslim world as such. Care to comment?
Yes, I think that's true, and it's not limited to Jews. And we saw over the past 10 years of the breakdown of the Middle East, the Arab Spring, and the way it evolved into a kind of chaotic situation. We saw that the minority populations were the first to go. So the Christians of Iraq, for example, this is a deep, ancient community, and many or most of them had to run, and they went to Australia, and some end up in Canada. The Yazidis, but the lucky ones get out, the unlucky ones are massacred. There are other stories of minority populations that, as soon as the protection of the regime is removed, then they're left to the mercy of the majority. And all I could think in those years, which by the way were the same years that I was writing this book, I started interviewing Yitzhak Shoshan in 2011, which is when the Syrian civil war breaks out. And all I could think throughout those years is what would happen if the Jews had still been there? You know, if the Jews had still been in Syria and the Jews had still been in Iraq, if a third of the population of Baghdad was still Jewish in 2011, what would have happened to those people? So, you know, we can criticize Israel and the militarism of Israel and, you know, this this overemphasis on strength. It often doesn't make sense if you're in the liberal West and not really cognizant of what can happen to a minority if it's weak in our part of the world. But for us, that's the main lesson. And the fact is that the majority of Jews in Israel come to Israel with that lesson, right? They come from the Islamic world with a deep understanding of what it means to be weak. That's their main lesson from the way that they leave their homes in Morocco and Syria and Yemen and Iraq. You can never be weak. And that informs their approach to the peace process, and it informs their approach to Yasser Arafat, and it informs their willingness to take risks. And because they've learned the hard way that if you turn your back in the Middle East, you're not going to get an embrace from your neighbor, you're going to get a knife in your back. And if you come from Canada, that kind of thinking seems terrible. And I imagine that that's true for most people from Norway or Sweden as well. This is just primitive thinking. You know, be the bigger man, do the right thing, and the world is moving toward justice and equality, so you can afford the risk. That's what I thought when I came to Israel. And Jews who came from the Arab world never thought that. And unfortunately, for me, the Canadian, their thinking seems to be a more accurate understanding of Middle Eastern logic than my Canadian thinking.
Thank you. Now we have to wrap it up. So I have a last question, because we have the Israeli ambassador coming after you.
Also important. We should give him a chance to talk.
Yes, and we will see if it will be a turn for the better or the worse. That will be. We will have to see. But anyway, the last question: why is pro-Israel advocacy important in Europe? What should friends of Israel, us included, say regarding the judicial reform when discussing with Israeli enemies, or I'm not sure. I think the main enemies of Israel in Europe.
So starting from the end of that question, I think that I haven't hidden my own politics. I think we have a terrible government in power at the moment, and I think that the policies that they're pursuing are causing incredible damage to Israeli society. So just we're not unclear about where I'm standing on this. But no country is perfect, right? And every country has very deep political debates about the nature of the state, and that's true, you know, of the United States, and it's true of Canada, and it's true here. And none of those debates mean that the country should or should not exist. It doesn't occur to anyone to say, okay, you know, the Republican Party is vile, thus America should not exist, or, you know, certain Norwegian policies are terrible, thus we should dismantle Norway and make it part of Sweden. It just wouldn't occur to anyone to level that kind of critique at any other country in the world. And when we're talking about Israel, we're really having that kind of discussion about the right of the country to exist. So I remove our internal political battles from that, and I can discuss them with you, and I can explain to you why I identify more closely with the center and left than with the right. But when we're facing an existential critique of Israel, then the important thing to say, I think, is that we support the country. We support the country. It's an important, it's a place that plays an important role in the world, not just as a refuge for Jews, but as a country that contributes a great deal to humanity. It's a correction to a great historical evil. It's a refugee camp in a war zone that has done better than anyone had a right to expect. We have our own political problems, and I hope that we can work them out, and I hope that we can do a better job of being cohesive as a society and telling our story better, which I think we don't do a great job of doing, and I think we can do a better job. But as a blanket statement, it warms my heart as an Israeli, with all the criticism that I have of the government, to be in a room full of people who are willing to leave their daily lives and get together to express support for the country where I live and the country that I love. We have many, many enemies, and it's just wonderful to see that we have friends. And I'm not someone who's prone to emotional sentiment or corny expressions of love and brotherhood, but it's deeply touching. And whatever it manages to do in the internal debate, I'm not sure if you'll be able to change the minds of 5 million Norwegians, but you definitely give Israelis something that we need, because our existence in the Middle East can feel quite lonely. And we often forget that we have friends. And the knowledge that we do means a lot to us, whatever it means in the society where you live and operate. So thank you again for having me, and thanks to Connor for organizing this. And whatever I've given you, believe me, you've given me more.
Thank you very much, Matti, for two absolutely enlightening lectures, giving food for thought and new perspectives. In preparation for this, we had a talk with Mossad about you. Yeah, and
I know.
Yes, but it turns out they were not comprehensive enough and not accurate enough. You already learned that you have more children than Mossad knew of. That's one thing. We got your height, we didn't get your weight. So we had the problem. What should we give you? Is this a football? Is this a book, or is it chocolate? Then we looked at it and we found out you can take chocolate. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for answering all the questions. And now, quarter of intermission, and please be back before 12 o'clock.